Right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Local Government Pension Board. I need to announce that this meeting will be held electronically, and members of the public may also attend in an electronic capacity, and there's a link on the Council's website for them to do so. Members of the board are asked to keep their microphones switched off until called to speak, and to switch their microphones off once they've finished speaking. Cameras may be left on throughout the meeting if members wish, but if you experience connection or other technical issues, it may help to switch your camera off. The camera should be switched on if and when speaking in the meeting. To indicate a wish to speak, members should use the raise hand function. Use of the meeting chat function is exclusively for voting. At the end of the debate on each item of business, there will be a vote. Members should vote using the chat function by indicating for, against, or abstain. I will declare the result after each vote. I would also add that I will be turning my camera and microphone off during the vote, as otherwise the view that the public gets during that thing of me is not the most edifying. Breaks of at least 15 minutes will be held every 2 hours and will be taken after a speaker in the debate has finished speaking. If we are voting at that point, the vote will be concluded before the break is taken. Other breaks will be incorporated as appropriate. So moving on then to part one, business generally. We've had apologies from Jack Byford, Terry Hone, Gail Johnson and Jolyon Adam. And for the benefit of any viewers to the meeting, I'd like to ask the board to introduce themselves, including their position on the board. And I'll call for those in the order I had them on my order paper. So Adam first.
Hello, I'm Adam Mitchell. I'm a county councillor from Broadwater in Stevenage and vice chairman.
Okay, and Rob McCarthy.
Good morning, I'm Rob McCarthy. I'm a standing substitute member. I'm chairman of the Hertfordshire Association of Parish and Town Councils. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Tim.
Good morning, everybody. Tim Perkins, retired member representative, previously chief officer and clerk to Abbots Langley Parish Council.
Thank you. James. No, James, I think you're on mute. No, I still can't hear you. If others can hear you, do a quick thumbs up in the...
I'll try again, sorry.
Oh, there you go, yes.
Hear me now? Yep.
Yes.
Good morning, James Hurley, member rep and substitute, and also retired member.
Okay, actually I failed to introduce myself. I'm Mike Collier. I'm a retired member and am chair of this board. As we've had a change of officers as well, could I ask the officers present to introduce themselves? Perhaps starting with Debbie.
Yes, I'm Deborah Jeffrey, Assistant Democratic Services Manager.
Thank you, Debbie. Teresa.
Teresa Baker, I'm supporting the meeting in the background.
Thank you, Teresa. Patrick.
Patrick Towie, head of the Hertfordshire Pension Fund.
Rob.
Yeah, Robert Winterton, the finance manager for the pensions team.
Okay, thank you. And we've got a couple of guest presenters as well this morning. Barry, are you there?
Yes, hello, I'm Barry Dodds. I am an actuary from Hymans Robertson, who are your fund actuaries.
Cheers. And Sandy?
Good morning all, Sandy Dixon from Mercer, who are the investment consultant to the fund.
Thank you. Now, I think that's everybody. If I have missed anybody else, apologise, make yourself known now. Sarah, I do apologise, yes. Oh, and right. And James, sorry, I hadn't noted that you joined. Sarah, please.
Hi, I'm Sarah Ansell. I'm an employer representative and I'm from the University of Hertfordshire.
Okay, James.
Hi, I'm James Kidd. I'm from Hertfordshire Constabulary and a employer representative as well.
Sharon.
Hi, I'm Sharon. I'm a substitute member rep as a deferred member as a former employee of the University of Hertfordshire.
Thank you. Well, humble apologies to those. Is there anybody else that I've missed out? No. Well, before we move on to the formal business of the meeting, I'd like to record my thanks to Teresa. She's in the background today to support Debbie, but she's standing down after several years supporting the board. She's certainly been supporting the board in the entirety of my time, and I've certainly appreciated her good humour, her organisation, and everything else. And I'm sure all members of the board would join me in that. I use members in the old-fashioned sense as those who are part of the board, and in welcoming Debbie, I'm sure you will support the board well going forward. Just to say that you have a lot to live up to. Before moving on, have I definitely included everybody now? I think I have. Okay. The first item on the formal business is the minutes. Before we take those, I just want to note that some items which are in matters arising are not covered in today's agenda, so we won't be picking those up as we go forward today, but they will be held forward to the next time. So the minutes of the last meeting. Can I just confirm that everybody has seen them, read them, and is happy with them? Please vote in the usual way. James, you have a question. James, you are on mute, I'm afraid. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, no, apologies. Sorry.
James, are you able to
mute?
If you're having problems, could you? We try to limit the meeting chat to just voting, but so that you can contribute to the meeting, could you perhaps type something in the meeting chat? Oh, sorry, James is happy with them. Sorry, I thought there was a substantive point there. Right, those are agreed. We move on to item 2, which is the triennial valuation of the fund. Patrick, I understand you're introducing this, and then you'll be handing over to Barry. So over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Mike. That is the case. Barry will talk to the appendix, which is the bulk of this report. The members of the board will have received an interim valuation back at their meeting in December, which showed that the fund had a funding value or a funding level of 106% and a surplus of 367 million. The addition to this report is the actual rates and contribution certificate, which the actuary is legally obliged to sign off by the end of the financial year, and that was signed off at the last after the pensions committee on the 30th of March. There has been a slight change to the position in that the surplus recorded at the meeting in December has improved from 367 to 370 million. That was all I was going to say, Chairman. In respect of an introduction, I was going to hand over to Barry, and he can talk through the body of the report.
Okay, then Barry, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so starting, I think the report I'm going to discuss starts on page 19 of your pack. So just to kind of get a bit of background, bit of refresher on what this is all about. Hopefully you remember there is an actuarial valuation that's been going on for the last kind of year and a half, probably, since we kind of started work on it. So this happens every 3 years. The intention is there's two main outputs really from the valuation. There's the assessment of funding level. So that's a kind of one point in time at that particular day. What do we estimate that the funding level was, and by that we mean how do the value of the benefits on a given day that you are that have been earned by members, the value of those benefits that are to be paid out in the coming decades, how does that compare to the assets that the fund is holding at that particular point in time? So that's one of the outputs. We not only do that at kind of whole fund level, but because there are kind of in the hundreds in terms of employers sitting within the fund, they each have their own funding position. So we do basically a valuation of hundreds of different employers. So each of them has their own funding position as well under the bonnet. So we do that as part of the valuation as well. So the funding levels are one of the outputs. The other output, as Patrick alluded to, is we work out what appropriate contribution rates are for all the employers as well, based on their individual situations. And that's recorded, as Patrick mentioned, in what's called the Rates and Adjustments Certificate, which is just at the end in an appendix to this final valuation report. So this report in itself is the formal valuation report. It is a report that Hymans, as your fund actuary, prepares and essentially kind of documents and summarises the formal valuation and what's gone on during the process. Documents the kind of a summarised version of the data that was used, the assumptions that have been used throughout, and indeed the results. So it's very much a kind of report for noting. There's not a kind of decision being made here. This was taken to committee, as Patrick said, on the 30th of March. This version in your pack is the draft version. There were slight changes between this draft version and the final version, which I will kind of note as I kind of take you through, but nothing dramatic, just some kind of tweaks here and there when final decisions were made on certain things. So it's all been signed off towards the end of March, and has, I believe, already been kind of published on the fund's website as well, and the relevant final valuation report has also been sent to government as required at the end of the process. So as I said, there's no kind of decision here, but it's for information. The actual content of the report, there's no new advice or anything in here. This is just kind of documenting the results and so on. So there's nothing kind of new. As Patrick mentioned, though, the whole fund valuation position, the funding position, is slightly different to what we presented initially in December, and that's just due to kind of tweaks to the data and kind of corrections being made to the data since then, as we went through the process. So there's a very slight change. That it's still 106% as the funding level, but there's a very small change to the surplus position. So you'll be glad to know I'm not going to take you through every single page of this document, but I'll just point out a couple of the key kind of areas. The first one I will point to, the document itself. So kind of, I suppose, the contents page, the document itself contains a lot of background information. So there's the approach to the valuation, how we actually kind of the methods we use to do the calculations and so on. There's the valuation results themselves. We are also obliged to give you advice on the sensitivity and a bit of risk analysis around the results. Basically, because we make we have to make an awful lot of assumptions about what's going to happen in the future in order to project the benefits that are going to be, we expect to be paid out. And so with those assumptions comes kind of risk that those assumptions aren't kind of correct and aren't borne out in practice. And so we show you a kind of sensitivity analysis to if we used slightly different assumptions, how much of an impact would that have, just as a kind of risk analysis. And then in the appendices, we've got the rates and adjustment certificate, as I mentioned earlier, and what's called the Section 13 dashboard, which I will also mention later on as well. So kind of fast forwarding a bit, we've been through a lot of the methodology stuff already with board and committee on the way through the process, so I wasn't really going to kind of dwell on that. I was going to kind of skip to the valuation results bit, and in particular page 29 of your pack. So that contains the kind of reported, the single reported funding level, we call it. Now, as I mentioned, this is at one point in time, so we take it at the 31st of March 2022. The position the very next day would be different, and the day after that, different again. So it's always changing, but for the purposes of the valuation, we have to choose it. Well, the date is chosen, and we have to use that date and assess it on that particular day. We have to report a single funding level using a single set of assumptions. We went through the assumptions process with committee and yourselves, and relevant assumptions were chosen. That's not to say that those assumptions will be borne out in practice, and no one set of assumptions is kind of the correct set of assumptions, because it's all based on kind of estimates of what might happen in the future. So we do have to report one single funding position, but we are conscious that there's various different approaches you could take and different assumptions that would result in different results. But we've established this as a kind of prudent funding approach and a kind of prudent set of results. So the results are shown on the table on the right hand side of page 29. So it shows you last valuation at 2019. It shows the position was 98% funded. The position at 2022 was 106% funded. So obviously an improvement and a good news story there. The next thing I was going to just pull out was on page 32. So page 32 contains a breakdown of basically kind of how we got from 2019 and that valuation position to the 2022 valuation position, kind of what's happened in the interim and money coming in, money going out, pension benefits being paid out and so on, and also kind of changes in membership and the impact of those and what's impacted that. So it's got, I'm not going to talk about every single figure in here. Again, you'll be glad to hear. I'll just pull out a couple of them. So on the right hand side, about 2/3 of the way down, there's a figure 720. It's probably the biggest figure in that whole table. And that is basically showing you that you had very good investment returns over the last 3 years between 2019 and 2022, which has contributed considerably to the improvement in your funding position. So your assets have gone up by quite a bit over the last 3 years to 2022. Another figure I'll pull out from there is inflation. So kind of two figures down from that, the red 435. So that's basically the impact of increases in the future expectation for inflation. So obviously inflation is very high right now. And certainly at 2019, we wouldn't have expected it to have reached these kind of levels. But at 2022, it was kind of already evident that it was heading in that direction. So we have made allowance for that within the valuation. So that shows that negative 435 is a kind of detrimental impact on your funding level to the sum of about £435 million that we're expecting inflation to be a bit higher than we were expecting at 2019. Another number I'll pick out of there is actually just above the 720. It's the 218, the red 218. We've labelled that other membership experience. So that number is actually a bit higher than we would normally expect to see for a fund. This is due to, I know we've discussed this before at board and it's been discussed at length at committee. There were some challenges in terms of the membership data and kind of consistency between the last valuation and this valuation and so on, which has actually impacted a bit on the liabilities in the sense that the data is showing that there's a higher liability now based on the membership data now than we had at the previous valuation. So that has had a bit of a impact on your funding level. LPPA is your administrator and Patrick and his officers have been in discussions and are putting in place a kind of data rectification plan to kind of resolve any outstanding data issues. And we have recommended to committee on the 30th of March a kind of data cleansing exercise be carried out as at the 31st of March next year, once hopefully the kind of data rectification plan has been kind of largely complete, so that it can be kind of assessed in terms of how much of an improvement there is in the data by that stage. Patrick may well want to jump in at this point and say something, but if not, I can carry on about the kind of plans for a data cleanse.
Thanks, Barry. Yes, the LPPA, who administer the fund, and officers from the fund have been in discussions about a data improvement strategy, and we have asked our actuaries Barry and Catherine, to provide oversight, and one of the requirements will be to provide a reconciliation from the 2023 position to the 2024 position. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Barry. And that will be done over the next 12 months just to check whether the data has, whether they've made adjustments to the data in order to address that experience number that's appeared in the valuation report. The LPPA are very conscious of our concerns about the data and have made significant changes in the back room and at the strategic level in order to address our concerns and also to make the necessary changes to improve the data quality. Members of the board will remember that LPPA changed their administration system last year. They moved from a system called Altair to UPM, and there was a significant transition project developed over 12 months, which has resulted in some of the issues that were experienced during the valuation.
Can I ask, Patrick, is there a cost involved in that? And if so, are LPPA funding those costs?
There is the fund pays a contribution to the overall budget. My understanding is that Stephen Pillsworth and I, who's the Director of Finance here at the County Council, met with Chris Rule, who's the Chief Executive at LPPA about a month ago. And he has agreed that this will be funded from LPPA coffers as opposed to the budget contributions.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments before we hand back to Barry? No, back to you then, Barry.
Great, thank you. Just to kind of staying on that point just now, it's LPPA. They administer, and the majority of what they do is kind of membership data, so the actual kind of service, salary, and so on of each member. What we also do, and what will be part of that data cleansing process, is making sure that the information coming out of that data cleanse at a membership level also matches the kind of cash flow information that we're seeing. So basically, if we are seeing an employer that we expect in their membership to be paying out, say, £10,000 a month in pensions, and the cash flow information actually says no, they're only paying out £5,000 in pensions, then that kind of thing, the plan is to address that as well, to make sure that there's consistency, that not only the membership data has been cleansed, but it's consistent with the cash flow data as well, which is key as well. Moving on from that, so the sensitivity analysis that I mentioned earlier is on basically a couple of pages on from there, so page 34. So as I mentioned, we do have to make quite a lot of assumptions about what might happen in the future in terms of investment returns, inflation, life expectancy, and so on, which all impact on the benefits that are going to be paid out, and indeed your assets and how we expect your assets to move going forward. So we've shown a couple of tables on this page 34 of your pack, which show the sensitivity around these assumptions. In particular, on this page, we show the inflation assumption sensitivity and the what we call demographic assumptions. That's the biggest demographic assumption, or the one that has the biggest impact, is life expectancy, as you might guess. Obviously, the longer somebody lives, the more pension you're paying out to them, so that the more money you need in the fund to pay that out. So we've shown again a sensitivity there in terms of a slight change in the life expectancy assumption. So assuming people live a little bit longer, then what's the impact of that on the funding level? As well as that, another risk that we analysed as part of the valuation is kind of summarised on page 36. So that's climate change, climate risk. So while we were modelling and coming up with appropriate contribution rates, in particular for the councils, we also did some modelling on various different climate scenarios. So we said, okay, if our model as it stands give us X result, then if we actually kind of stress that model based on various different climate scenarios that might happen in the future, how does that impact on the results that were coming out in terms of risk analytics? So basically, likelihood of success is one of the main ones we use. So the kind of core model there that we've shown was showing about an 82% likelihood of success of the contribution rates, which is quite high. That's a good result. And we've modelled 3 different potential climate scenarios. And said, okay, well, if we stress that model at various different points in time, depending on various approaches to climate change, does that significantly impact that kind of likelihood of success? And also we have a downside risk measure. And the results you'll see there, yes, it does impact. So there is a reduction in the likelihood of success, but it's still a pretty robust approach that we take, because you're still pretty high. 79%, 78% is still quite a high likelihood of success. And so that just shows a kind of the robustness of the funding approach that the fund is taking, that we can be comfortable that it's looks like it will be able to kind of deal with climate change scenarios, or it's flexible enough to be able to deal with that and robust enough. Into the appendices, I won't go through. There's various summary kind of tables in the appendices about data and so on. I'll not go through those in great detail, but I will kind of scan forward to the rates and adjustment certificates. So that starts on page 50 of your packs. So as I mentioned earlier, we look at the fund at whole fund level, but we also look at each individual employer and work out an appropriate contribution rate. And those are all listed in this part of the appendix. You'll see some of them in this draft version were kind of yellow, kind of highlighted yellow and to be confirmed. They've since been confirmed, and obviously the report has been signed off. So all of these have been finalised. So there were slight tweaks between this version and the final version, but nothing dramatic. So they've got each individual employer listed there, or indeed if they're a member of a kind of pool of employers, then that's listed as a pool. And on page 51 itself, what we also have to work out is kind of at whole fund level, what does the whole fund expect to get in contributions over the next 3 years, and that's noted there on page 51 as well. Again, those figures slightly changed when the final those final few kind of yellow highlighted employers were finalised. Then those figures slightly changed as well, but nothing dramatic, as I say. So that's where we kind of detail all of that information. What we also have to do, and that there was a kind of placeholder for it on pages 58 and 59, is what's called the Section 13 dashboard. Now, this is basically the Government Actuaries Department collates a lot of information from each individual LGPS fund, and kind of basically kind of does some analysis, various analysis over the coming kind of year or two, or maybe even 3, depending on how long it takes, to actually kind of try and measure some idea of consistency between the different funds and what approaches you're taking, if there is consistency. And also they do, what we have to do is do an additional calculation which says, okay, on this set of assumptions that the Government Actuaries Department specifies, what's the funding level on this other set of assumptions. And basically the idea behind that is that they're able to make some kind of comparison from one fund to another on exactly the same set of assumptions, what the funding level is. So they do a lot of comparison work over the next 2 or 3 years, I imagine, and they publish a report which kind of shows some potentially interesting statistics. That dashboard itself isn't contained within this draft version that was in the papers, but it was contained in the final version, largely because we didn't actually receive information on the format of what that was supposed to look like until after these papers were published. So the final version does have that dashboard within it, and all of the LGPS funds in England and Wales will have the same format of dashboard at the end of their report as well, and it'll be you'll be able to see the Government Actuaries Department's report when it comes out in terms of comparisons from one fund to another, however helpful or otherwise that is. I would kind of say that each fund is different. You all have different investment strategies. Each fund may have a different approach to funding, a different approach to how you set contribution rates and so on. So there will be differences between funds, and legitimately so. But it is it's potentially still interesting to see how that compares on one specific basis. So I think that was largely all I was going to cover, and happy to take any questions.
Any questions from anybody or comments? Not seeing any hands raised. No, so it's Patrick just coming back in just in case there's anything he needs to answer, I assume. But I've not got any questions or comments, but certainly I would like to welcome the healthy state of the fund and to commend all involved, particularly given what has been fairly challenging times since the last valuation. So I would ask, as we vote to note the draft report and draft rates, we also welcome the healthy state of the fund. Could I ask that you vote within the chat in the usual way, please? Okay, that has been duly noted. We move on. Barry, you are welcome to stay, but also aware how busy you are. If you do need to dip out, please feel free to do so.
Great, thank you very much. I'll probably check with Sandy, see if he wants me to hang around. If he's good, he may need me later on for his investment bit, but if not, then I shall keep off. But thank you very much.
Okay, right. Sorry, go on, Sandy.
As I say, Barry, unless you have, and I appreciate you being focused on the valuation, so you might not have this information, but unless you can provide any input into an updated funding level given the volatility of markets. I don't think that'll really be needed, but I don't know if that would provide any comfort to board.
I can't give you a number, but I can tell you it'll be better now than it was back at the valuation.
That's all. That's wonderful news to hear, and I think that's probably all we need to know as a board before we go into markets later.
Great.
Thanks, Barry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
So thank you very much, Barry. Cheers. So that moves us on to item 3 on the agenda, which is the Responsible Investment Work Plan, the Analytics for Climate Transition. And Patrick, you're introducing this one and then handing over to Sandy, I believe.
That's correct. So there is this paper in the part 1 papers, and then there's some more detail, additional information in the first agenda item and part 2. And the reason it's in part 2 is it contains some proprietary research, which we don't want to disclose in the public domain. But there is enough information here in this part 1 report to give members of the public who are listening into this report enough information about the fund's transition plans and how it's going to achieve its agreed target, which is to decarbonise the fund by 2050. The report, which there is a cover report and there's a lot of detail in the appendix, which I'll let Sandy talk to. Briefly, the report sets out stage 2, work stream 2 of the RI work plan, which was agreed back in March 2022. There's 5 work streams in this plan. The first work stream was the RI policy, which was completed and signed off by the Pensions Committee last month following consultation with employers. Work stream 2 now builds on the policy and looks to develop a transition plan to meet this target and metrics to measure the progress over time. So at the meeting of the Pensions Committee on the 30th of March, the committee agreed a baseline that they would use to take measurements, and that would be from the 31st of March 2020, and agreed that several metrics would be used for measuring this, with the primary one being the carbon footprint. There was also an agreement that a proposed interim target of a 43% reduction by 2030 would be used, and the analysis that is provided in the report gives an indication of what the fund looks like at the moment in respect of its carbon emissions, where there are managers, where there is some areas which we need to explore with them, where the managers such as Dodge and Cox, where there's higher carbon intensity than other managers, and that will form part of the stewardship and engagement with the managers to understand their plans for continued investment in those companies that are displaying high emissions, and their future investments in alternative sort of companies where there are greener plans and, so to speak, transition plans to decarbonise as well. I'm not going to say much more to the cover report, and I was going to hand over to Sandy unless members got any questions on the cover report, but I would suggest the questions come after Sandy's done his presentation.
Okay, unless anyone then has a very pressing question on the cover report. I'm not seeing any hands raised, so over to you, Sandy.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Chair. So obviously I'm conscious that members of the board might well have seen this paper. We had a meeting on the 17th of January where we took time to go through this report. So I wasn't planning to go through it in detail because obviously you've seen it before, but I was going to pull out some of the key aspects from it. So this is the analytics for climate transition. All the data was run as at 31st of March 2022. So actually in line with the actuarial evaluation. Obviously has been discussed before. The purpose of the analysis report is sort of twofold. First of all, it's almost like draws a line in the sand and is a bit backward looking, going, okay, over the previous year in the companies that we have invested in, what are the ongoing emissions that they have had over that time period? And it almost then compares to the index. The portfolio of the fund is actually more efficient in its use of carbon than a comparative index. So based on sort of carbon footprint, we're 25% more efficient than if we just invested passively in the market index. So obviously we're using 25% less carbon ongoing in the underlying companies than the index. If you do it on a slightly different metric, which is the weighted average carbon intensity, so that's looking at the intensity based on the revenues of underlying companies, it's actually 33% more efficient. So in terms of how the fund's positioned, we are more efficient than the index. So I think that's probably quite a positive position thinking about climate change and climate risk into the future. So that's sort of the backward looking. It's almost looking in the rearview mirror going, okay, what's happened there? The second part of it is really looking forward and going, okay, the companies that are managed to invest on our behalf, what is their capacity to transition? So this is this grey to green. There are certain grey sort of companies where we think there's very limited ambition from the companies and potential to transition. But then also there are companies that might be quite high carbon emitters now, but actually have the potential to decarbonise and be part of future solutions. Companies like cement companies often fall into this sort of bracket, in that it is quite carbon intensive to create cement, but obviously we need cement for rail and infrastructure, which is obviously going to be part of the low carbon economy if we move away from air travel and the like. So that's sort of the background to ACT, and obviously we had that session. I was going to touch on the three main decisions that the committee made at the meeting on the 30th of March before I open up to questions. So the first one was sort of agreeing and setting a baseline. The committee agreed to set a baseline for measuring and monitoring on our target to 2050 of 31st of March 2020. So this is when we did we have data at that point. It's fairly well aligned with the IIGCC, so that's the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. Their line in the sand is actually 31st of December 2019, so we're 3 months different. But the rationale and the reason why we've done it at 31st of March is because that's when we do our annual report and accounts, and so it's very much lined up with how the fund is viewed and monitored. And if we're doing it every year, then clearly it will then align with actuarial evaluations as well, which are also on the 31st of March. So that's why the line in the sand is sort of drawn at that stage. As Patrick mentioned, and as I touched on a bit earlier, in terms of primary metrics, ultimately we're going from a region of we have carbon now, net zero 2050 is 0. So regardless of which carbon metric you want to monitor, we need to go from 100 down to 0 over a period of time. We have chosen carbon footprint for the fund, and the carbon footprint looks at your total emissions and divides it by the amount you invest. So as an investor, you have control of the amount you invest. Other metrics such as weighted average carbon intensity, that's on the revenues of the company, which is slightly it's important to understand, but really as an investor thinking about how much we invest, we prefer to normalize by the amount we invest. So that's why we've gone for carbon footprint. As Patrick mentioned, we will be monitoring other metrics as well, because they do provide different pieces of information, but the primary metric where we're setting our target is on carbon footprint as agreed by committee. And the last one was these interim targets. The fund had already agreed and set a net zero target by 2050, but part of this analysis was going, well, we know where we want to get to eventually. We now need to have a plan of how to get there. We've drawn a line in the sand at 2020. We need to get to 0 by 2050. That means if you split it up equally, that'd be a third, so a 33% in those each 10-year buckets. What we've done for 2030 is align with the IPCC. So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that's a UN organization. They've done a lot of the scientific work around this. And in their median curve, they target a 43% reduction by 2030. So we're thinking about, if we just did a third, it'd be 33%, 43% mean it's slightly more aggressive. We're trying to decarbonize more early on. And then obviously that means that in future, if the world evolves at a faster pace than we're expecting, you could always bring in that 2050 target. But targeting 43%, I think, is fairly ambitious. It's more than just a straight line. Equally, if we think about how we're basing it on the fund's baseline as well, and because the fund is already more carbon efficient than the index, it means that there's probably less low-hanging fruit, so to speak. So I think 43% is achievable. It's in line with the science, but it's also fairly ambitious as well at the same point in time. So those are the three decisions agreed by committee. I will stop there and more than happy to answer any questions on the report, because I appreciate there's quite a lot of detail in there.
So, okay, any questions from others? No one has. Oh, hang on. Yeah, Sharon.
Thank you. It's not a question on the report, but I wanted to note that the net zero date of 2050 could be subject to challenge by stakeholders as not being ambitious enough. Whether some fund employers could have committed to an earlier date. And I note in the report that it mentions a comms and engagement plan with stakeholders. And I would suggest that that we attempt to answer this up front, but I'm sure that's already been considered and is in hand. But I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Does do either Patrick or Sandy want to comment on that? You don't have to. Just note it at this stage.
Yeah, I will. In respect of the 2050 target, the fund invests in government gilts, and Sandy, you can explain a bit further on this. And we will continue to hold gilts in the portfolio because of the nature of that they're particularly index linked. They have similar characteristics to the payments that we need to make. Because the government's target is 2050, and they could change that, policy could change in the next few years and they could bring it forward. If we were trying to decarbonise quicker than the government target, we can't, because we've got index linked gilts in that portfolio. And so we'll always have that carbon element in it. So it's a bit challenging to decarbonise earlier than that. And I've seen some and attended some presentations where some corporate funds have said, yeah, we're going to set a target of 2040. And then one of them, I think it was the BT, lead BT fund officer said, well, we've got index linked gilts in the portfolio and it's going to be challenging to decarbonise. So that there is that issue to address. And if the government changes their targets and brings it forward, then yeah, we would this is not a set target. We can move that target in line with government policy. But I think that's the gist of it, isn't it, Sandy?
Yeah, so I think it's very important to remember that this pension fund we're investing in assets across a range of geographies, not only so obviously UK government gilts, so that would have net 2050, but obviously we would invest in emerging markets, and actually emerging markets, because they've emitted less in the past, have got a slightly further net zero dates further out than 2050 as well. So thinking about that, clearly, we invest across a range: equities, bonds, alternatives, property, and the like. So as an investor that invests internationally, I think it's a slightly different scenario to maybe an employer or an individual company that has complete control over their own emissions compared to us as an investor. So as Patrick said, we have investments in UK index-linked gilts, so that's lending to the UK government. The current UK government policy is 2050 target, so that's why we've sort of aligned with that. And I think it would be quite challenging to bring it a lot further forward. But as Patrick said, it's still quite a long way. Technology could develop, and if the government brings its target forward, then there's no reason why the fund can't also bring its target forward in future.
Okay, Adam.
Thank you. I'm looking at the decarbonisation path, agenda pack, page 76. Am I reading it correctly in that in 2022 there was actually more carbon used by the fund than in the previous 2 years? Is that a correct reading?
Yeah, so the carbon footprint of the fund increased over those 2 years, yes.
So why hasn't the reduction been rebased to 2022? I mean, that's quite a big gap now between 2022 and 2023. Is that realistic? Are there reasons why that hasn't been rebased?
Yeah, so we wanted to draw a line in the sand as at 31st of March. That's our starting point. And so we want to go from our starting point and then over the next 10 years decarbonise by the target of 43%. As you allude to, over the first couple of years, we went slightly backwards. I mean, one of the reasons for that was the introduction of Dodge & Cox Value Manager, slightly more carbon intensive. That's actually worked out in terms of performance-wise over the last year, given the events of 2022. But I think I still think it's quite important to maintain our first line in the sand and the current target. And it's not going to be a straight line. Some years will be probably in advance of that target. Sometimes we might.
No, that's fine. And I think just added to what I've said before, I think it might have been interesting to see maybe 5 or 10 years before 2020 as well, to see if we were already going in a downward path or whether we've gone up to that point. Was 2022 the highest step that it's ever been, for example? It would have been nice to have some context, I think, previous to that time. So maybe next time we could see a bit of that.
So the only challenge to that is that carbon data really much before sort of 2019, it's lacking.
Okay, that's fair.
We just don't have that data, unfortunately, to make any meaningful analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Patrick, you wanted to come on in on that?
Yeah, it was just to add to Sandy's comment there, that the fund started measuring its carbon footprint from September 2019 was the first time we did this, and we've been presenting an annual carbon report to both the committee and board every year since, and the next one will be due in September, October, around that time of year. So you'll again be able to see what's happened. Sandy, I don't know if you wanted to comment on the impact of the economy reopening after COVID, and that also might have skewed the carbon footprint to an extent, because if we look at 2020 and 2021, the economy wasn't working at full capacity, so to speak, across all geographic zones, and that would potentially explain why the footprint has gone up slightly.
Yeah, certainly global emissions, obviously, as part of the economies are shut down, were lower. You know, when we were all confined to our homes and we couldn't drive around, and that's a global front, there was less emissions, so that's probably feeding in slightly into some of these numbers as well. But thinking about the fund, the primary driver was sort of a change in strategy within the equities.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands raised at the moment. So Sandy, back to you.
I wasn't planning on saying anything else, Chair, unless.
Okay, sorry, I thought you had paused for questions as opposed to that was the end. Right. Okay, so are there any other questions or comments on the report or Sandy's explanation? I'm not seeing any. In that case, then I'll ask people to vote in the usual way. Okay, that has been noted. Item 4 on the agenda is dates of future meetings. Members may recall that at the last meeting we discussed the possibility of having every other meeting in person at County Hall. There are challenges around that. One of which, of course, would be our carbon footprint. Just linking it to the previous item. It has been suggested that we change our opinion from last time to be that we aim to meet at least twice a year in person, and one of those meetings to be the autumn meeting, because that's the one at which the auditors would normally be present. So can I ask if anyone's got any comments they want to make on that? I'm not seeing any hands raised, so that being the case, could I ask that you vote in the chat in the usual way and say whether you agree to having thing to be that we aim to meet in person at least twice per year, at least one of which to be the autumn meeting. Okay, that is agreed. That being the case, I ask members to also, as part of that, note the dates of the next meeting, and there'll be further information on which ones will be in person and which ones will be virtual. The other thing that, very remiss of me, I should have said under the general membership that, oh, hang on, Rob, I've got a comment from Rob. Can I?
Yeah, just a question following up on that vote. I mean, is it going to be possible at an in-person meeting for people to attend virtually if it is more convenient or suitable or practical for them to do so? I mean, presumably some consultants and advisors would quite like to attend virtually anyway.
I think that whilst certainly for members and employer reps on the board, I would encourage attendance in person if at all possible, because I believe it helps to foster the sort of camaraderie and the good working of the board. But Patrick, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. We do have a hybrid way of running these meetings in the council chamber, and Sandy, who is based up in Yorkshire, and our actuary who's based up in Glasgow, they have presented via that mode of media recently. And essentially that is, if there is, for example, if Sandy's only presenting one paper, it's quite a big carbon footprint again to make him travel all the way down to Hertfordshire to present a paper for half an hour. So we do use the hybrid method. With members, I would say that is on exception, because we would rather, if we are only going to have 2 meetings in person here, I'd rather members attend, than it is on exception basis. Potentially, if it's a member's not feeling well or can't travel in because of I don't know, for particular circumstances, then we could use the hybrid for that, the purpose of that meeting. But I agree with you, Chairman, that if we're going to have 2 meetings in person, members of the board should all attend in person.
Rob?
Yeah, I would just make the point that I'm not technically a member. I'm a standing substitute member, and the travel to and from Hertford really doubles the time I spend, from 3 hours to 6 hours. Just a point I'd like to make, Chair.
Okay, I think we note that, Rob. So, okay, what I was trying to say was that it was remiss of me not to cover under membership of the board, but I need to notify people that this, in fact, will be my last meeting, because for personal reasons I need to stand down. So I would like to formally record my thanks to all the participants, all the members and employers and officers, for the support you've given me over my time as a member and as chairman. So that being the case, I now need to formally move that we move into part 2, and I notify that under section 100. Hang on, Tim has just raised his hand.
Is there a chance to raise something under other business, Chairman?
Other business is usually notified in advance.
Yes.
Is it so urgent that it can't wait until the next meeting?
It's just timely, and I'll take your decision on it graciously. It's just the news yesterday that Link had been sold. It was the subject of much conversation at the joint access meeting that Adam and I attended back in December, I think it was. And I just wondered if perhaps Patrick had any view on any impact that might be, or when we might hear something more. That was only it, Chairman. It's literally breaking news, and it's still breaking today, I think it's fair to say.
Yes. Patrick, is there anything you want to say on that? I mean, my inclination would be, as it is still breaking news and we do have another meeting on the 11th of July, that I wouldn't ordinarily have wanted it. But Patrick, can I ask for an immediate response?
Yeah, I was at an access meeting in London yesterday, and this was discussed. It is positive news, but no contracts have been signed at the moment. They have to go through the appropriate FCA channels to get authorisations. Contracts that they currently have with organisations like ourselves have to be novated across to the new provider. And it's common knowledge, it's all in the financial press. There has been, the FCA have approved a settlement to the Woodford investors. I think it's about 235 million is the package. And however, there is some litigation going on in the background. We don't know whether that is going to stop now, but the assets the contracts that we have with Link will novate across to Woodford. Then they'll be subject to, we will do a review of Woodford due diligence, sorry, not Woodford, Waystone due diligence and Waystone to ensure that they meet the requirements that are being delivered currently through Link. We've been given assurances by Link officers that there'll be no change, it'll be seamless transfer. And we are going through a procurement of this contract in next year anyway. However, the procurement could be influenced by the assessment of whether Waystone honour some of the current conditions that we receive from Link, which we've been assured will be the case. That's all I was going to say, because this is quite a moving feast, but it's positive news in that officers were slightly concerned that we'd have to do an emergency procurement. That is not likely to be the case now. It looks as though the FCA are quite happy with the proposal between Link and Waystone, and also the settlement of the Woodford issue, and the retail investors and some professional investors who are invested in that Woodford fund. So it's positive news, but there's not much more I can add, I'm afraid.
Okay, so it would appear I did allow the item of AOB. So, does anyone else wish to comment on that as I've admitted it to the meeting, bearing in mind we are still in part one? No, it would appear not. So I will now formally move that under section 100A(4) of the Local Government Act 1972, the press and public be excluded from the meeting for the following items of business on the grounds that they involve the likely disclosure of exempt information relating to the financial or business affairs of any particular person, including the council, as defined in paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 12A to the said act. And the public interest in maintaining the exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. So I will wait now to hear that we have stopped the broadcast before moving in to that business.